In the last video, I discussed color versus transparency versus definition with regards to using particular shapes for chord voicings. In this video, I'm going to get into another important topic that we're going to use all the time. And today I'm just going to get into a really quick overview of it. But I'm going to go over the characteristic of each individual note within a major tonality and the major scale, starting with the Ionian scale for now. If I take this Ionian scale, the notes do, mi, and so are going to be heard as resting tones. Those are going to be points of resolution. They're going to be resting, they're going to be where phrases end, they're going to be home base or the period at the end of a sentence, so to speak. Re and la are going to be active whole steps, which means their point of resolution is a whole step away. Active half steps include fa and ti. Those notes are going to want to resolve, and they're going to want to resolve by half step. And the next group of notes is going to be chromatic notes. And the role of chromatic notes is to connect the whole steps of the scale. So those are going to want to resolve by half step. The important active tones are going to be the tones that center around the half steps of the scale. The notes fa and ti are going to be the most important tones. And the most important resting notes are going to be the notes do and mi. And the reason for that is because those notes make up and define the half steps of the scale. And that's important because be it the major scale, melodic minor scale, diminished scale, whole tone scale, and any given tonality that you're working with is actually defined by the unique arrangement of half steps that it has. So for example, the major scale is defined by two pairs of half steps a perfect fourth apart. The melodic minor scale has two pairs of half steps a minor third apart. The diminished scale has four pairs of half steps, and the whole tone scale has no half steps at all. So it's these half steps or lack of half steps within a structure that defines the tonality and defines the scale source. So these half steps are really important, and these tones are going to come into play when we start figuring out basic harmony, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So if I want to break everything down and make it really simple, all functional harmony can basically be broken down into active chords and resting chords. Active chords being 5 chords in a general key center, and resting chords being 1 chords in a general key center. Basically, everything else is either a plural substitute for those chords, or a passing chord connecting those chords, or a half-step approach chord into those chords. But all other chords are either functioning as some kind of plural substitute or some kind of ornamentation. Everything can really be broken down into 2 functions, which is active and resting, and 5 to 1. And it occurs in various different key centers with various different ornamentations, but that's the nuts and bolts of pretty much Western music in general. And that boils down to half steps. So if I'm looking at the note fa, that's going to want to come down to mi. Fa resolves downwards to mi. Ti resolves upwards to do. So there we go. So the sound of an active part of your tonality resolving to a resting part is either fa going to mi or ti going to do, not only melodically but harmonically. And this is basically where the beginnings of functional harmony come into play. For a quick example, I'm going to take a look at 251 and demonstrate how these half steps essentially define both the harmony and the melodic characteristics of the scale. So if I'm looking at D minor 7 to G7 to C major, all right, 251 in the key of C. This is the sound of 5 to 1, the D minor being an extension of the 5 chord. And what's going on, as you can see, these chords spell out the half steps. So the third of the two chord, the third, which defines the chord quality, also happens to define the half steps of the scale. So it makes sense that fa is the third of the two chord, do is the seventh of the two chord. The third and the seventh are the definitive tones of any given chord. So fa and do. The seventh of the five chord is also fa, and the third of the five chord is T. Both of those are active tones. Not only active tones, but they're the active tones which rest on the half steps of the scale. And then finally we have do and we have mi. So the whole sound of active to resting that defines a tonality hinges on these half steps. In particular, the fa, fa, mi line combined with the do, ti, do line. That is the nucleus of a 2-5-1, no matter what other notes, what other tensions, whatever else you're using. The essence of it is do, ti, do, and fa, fa, mi. That is the sound of active resolving to resting. So now we start getting into taking these individual notes from the scale and stacking them up and putting them into chord form. And when these notes are stacked up and put into chord form, they still maintain their characteristics of active versus resting. So what we have is first generation harmony is harmony that is just going to be triads. The most important and strongest consonant triad that we have is the major triad. So if we look at the three major triads out of the major scale, that is going to take care of all of the notes found within that major scale. And therefore, any melody note can be harmonized with any of these three triads, which are the strongest, most consonant sound. So harmony really starts with this basic concept, just basic 1 chord, 4 chord, and 5 chord to harmonize the scale. That's the most natural, straightforward harmony. And obviously later on, there's infinite amounts of variations. But when you're talking about how harmony works and what everything sounds like and why things are the way they are, we start at the beginning, which is first generation harmony using major triads. So if I take the C major triad, it's made of do, mi, and so. Every note in that triad is heard as resting, and therefore it brings that characteristic even when combined with other notes. So the C major, or the 1 major, in any given major tonality is going to be heard as resting. Not only that, don't forget that the third of the chord defines the chord. So the third of this 1 major triad is mi, and that's going to be heard as resting. From now on, any chord that has the note fa in a fundamental position, as in the root, the third, or the fifth, any chord that has that fa in it is going to be heard as active. Any chord that has T in a fundamental position is also going to be heard as active. And any chord that has mi or do in a fundamental position is going to be heard as resting. So if I look at the 4 chord, the root of the 4 chord is fa. That's about as fundamental as it gets. This chord is going to be heard as active. The third of the chord, which defines the chord itself, is also an active tone. And then the fifth is do, it's resting. But the root and the third are both active tones, and they have fa in the chord structure, so this is going to be heard as an active chord. And then the next major triad that we have is a G major triad. The root is going to be heard as resting, but the third of the chord, which defines the chord, is T, and that T is the active half step, which defines the scale. And the fifth is going to be re, the note D, which is also active. And this takes care of all of our notes found within the major scale. We can harmonize any note just with these 3 major triads. Okay, so now let's take these melody notes and assign them to the 1 chord, the 4 chord, or the 5 chord. Basically what we're working with is if you have do, mi, or so, that belongs to the 1 chord. If you have fa, la, or do, that can go to the 4 chord. So you can see already that do is common to both the one chord and the four chord. And so what you want to do is you have an option. When you run into do in the melody, you decide what chord you want to pick by which one you're hearing. So if you're hearing an active chord, you're going to use the four chord. If you're hearing a resting chord, you're going to use a one chord. And that's how you determine which triad that you want to use. Both of them are fine, but it just depends on what sound you're hearing and what you want. So now getting into the five chord, that has the notes so, ti, and re. So if you have the notes so, ti, re, that's going to belong to your five chord. And it's a similar situation with the four chord and the one chord, and that so is common both to the five chord and to the one chord. So the deciding factor is, are you hearing a chord that's resting, or are you hearing a chord that's active? So this takes care of the whole scale. Any of these notes can be harmonized simply with a one chord, a four chord, or a five chord. And that's kind of the origins of harmony as we know it. And it grows arms and legs from there very quickly. I just covered major today. Minor also has its group of characteristics and one chords, four chords, and five chords that go along with first generation harmony. But that's a different lesson that I'm going to give later on. I want to expand on this a little bit more. Okay, so if I wanted to harmonize the major scale with triads, it breaks down like this. Do, mi, and so belong to the one chord. Fa, la, and do belong to the four chord. And so, ti, and re belong to the five chord. And then you have dealer's choice, depending on whether or not you're hearing an active chord or a resting chord on those common tones that are common between the one chord and the four chord and the one chord and the five chord. So what we have is, if I just start on C, that's do. It's common to both the one chord and the four chord. You can use either a C triad or an F triad, depending on whether or not you hear active or resting. If I have re, that belongs to the five chord, G major. If I have mi, that belongs to the one chord, that's a C major. If I have the note fa, that belongs to the four chord, that's an F major. If I have the note so, that could either be heard as active by using a G triad, major triad, or it can be heard as resting if I want to use a C major triad to harmonize that tone. Even though that tone itself is resting, the harmony that goes along with it still carries with it the characteristics of the notes that make up that harmony. So even though that note is resting, you still have active versus resting options for harmony. When I get to la, that's going to go to the four chord. When I get to ti, that's absolutely going to go to the five chord. That's essentially the sound of the five chord. And then we get back to do, which takes me back to the one chord or to the four chord. But if I'm ending a phrase or ending cadencing, I'm probably going to just use a one chord for resting. Okay, so now I'm going to demonstrate harmonizing the major scale with these triads, these basic first generation 1-4-5 major triads within a major tonality. So as I said, do, mi, so is harmonized with a one chord. Fa, la, do is harmonized with a four chord. And so, ti, re is harmonized with a five chord. And then for the notes do and so, you have dealer's choice, depending on whether or not you're hearing an active chord or a resting chord, because those tones are common to both active and resting chords. So you'll see what I mean in a minute. But if I just take the major scale and I go up the major scale with the triads, it's like this. There's do, there's my one chord, my C major. Re, that's a five chord, G major. Mi, resting, one chord, C major. Fa, active, four chord, F major. So, active, G major, or resting, C major. You can hear the difference. This definitely sounds like resolution. And this definitely sounds like it needs to be resolved. So that's so. La, again, we have the the four chord, F major. T, we have the five chord, In do, we have a resting 1 chord. Or you can use an active 4 chord. Or resting 1 chord. So that's it. Do, re, mi, fa, so, active, la, ti, do. Okay, so now that we assign the melody note to one of the 4 major triads, I'm going to take a basic melody and demonstrate how to harmonize an actual melody. So I'm going to pick Happy Birthday. That's a good one. Nursery rhymes are good. Any super simple diatonic melody is a good place to start with these so that you're not fumbling around with a complicated melody while you're trying to figure out what voicings to use and what chords to use. So it's always easier just to start super simple. So, and plus you never know when you're on a gig anyway and it's somebody's birthday and they want you to play Happy Birthday. So that comes up. It's good to know it. You might as well. So it goes like this. So, so, la, so, do, ti. So if I'm going to start with G, I'm going to start active. That's what I'm hearing. So I could use C. It sounds like this. But I want to use an active sound. So I'm going to use the G major triad to harmonize the note so. I'm hearing that. So on so, G. On la, F major. Back down to so. You could also go to C if you wanted. So it just depends on what you're hearing. But I like the active part. I like keeping this active for now. So on do, I have a choice between C major or F major. Let's try it with the F major. I don't like the sound of that F major at all. That's even worse than the difference between C major and G major. That stands out big time. I don't like it. I don't like that sound at all. So I'm going to use the resting chord C because I like it a lot better. I don't like that active F right there. That's just my ears. I think that sounds a lot better than this. So one more time. So that's the first part of it. Again, I'm going to use active. So, so, la, so, re, do. Now on re, do, I used 5 to 1, but you can also do 5 to 4 because do is common tone to both 1 and 4. So let's see what that sounds like. Once again, that's the sound of that active 4 chord, and I don't like it there again, so I'm going to use the 1 chord. So it sounds like this. So now the whole thing. So this part, the next part, to wrap it up. So, up an octave, down to mi, down to do, to the ti, to la. So again, so, mi, do, ti, la. I'm going to harmonize that so with the 5 chord, up an octave. Actually, that's a I want a resting sound there. I'm going to use C major instead of G7, or instead of G major. So on the so, I'm going to use the 5 chord. I like it active there. But then for the remainder of it, so, mi, do, I'm going to use a C major triad for all of these. So it'll sound like this. And then T, La. So on T, I used my 5 chord, G major. On La, I used the active F chord. And so the whole thing sounds like this. And to close it out, Fa, Mi, Do, Re, Do. On Fa, I'm going to use the F major. On Mi, I'm going to use the 1 major. On Do, I'm going to use 1. On Re, I'm going to use 5. And on Do, I'm going to use 1. Or 4 for that sus4 to 1. So from here, try it again. Fa, Mi, Do, Re. So the whole thing. Actually, I like the C there. So here's the whole thing together. And that's the whole thing.